Just to try to say this. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Samuel.
Okay, we are also colleagues from CSO. Good afternoon. My name is Mundi from Anthony. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ika from Anthony.
Good afternoon. Very, very member from our community.
I'm delivering one skill. We also allow the high table.
Yes, it is. Good afternoon, everyone. I am from Chapel Foundation.
My name is Sharon Williams from Women and Law in
Good afternoon, Maurice Nyamde from TSS.
Good afternoon, Lauren. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greg. Okay, thank you so much. Having introduced myself, I will now invite the Executive Director for Alliance for Community Action, Madam Laura Meeting, to officially open this question. Good afternoon. What you are officially opening, but I think my role is to welcome introduce you which brings together a number of civil society organizations, some represented here, but more who have come together for this statement, which is our response to the constitutional amendment bill that the government has just recently released. And so what we'd like to share with you today is our thoughts on the content, and that will be done by Sir Maurice Nyamde.
All right, thank you very much, Laura. Good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. So we, the undersigned civil society organizations, having carefully examined the content and implications of the proposed constitutional reforms, wish to reiterate and express our concerns regarding both the process and the substance of the proposed amendments. While we firmly acknowledge the necessity of constitutional reform to consolidate our democracy, we are equally convinced that such a process must be transparent, inclusive, and deliberative in order to be legitimate and sustainable. Unfortunately, the current proposals and process fall short on all these fronts. Rather than addressing Zambia's long-standing governance deficits in a meaningful and cohesive manner, they offer fragmented, inconsistent, and at times regressive changes that risk compounding existing weaknesses in our constitutional order. We stress that constitutional reform must not be approached through isolated tinkering or political expediency. Instead, it requires a holistic understanding of how various institutions and provisions interact to support democratic governance, the rule of law, accountability, and inclusive development. Reform proposals should therefore be guided by transparent and rigorous analysis, broad-based public consultation, and a commitment to democratic renewal. Regrettably, the current process lacks these qualities and fails to inspire public confidence. While our concerns span multiple aspects of the proposed amendment, we wish to highlight the following key areas that are particularly problematic and emblematic of the broader flaws of the entire process. So there are 8 key areas that we're going to highlight. The first one is the mixed member proportional representation and increase in number of constituencies, which we are saying is a superficial and poorly conceived reform. The proposed introduction of a mixed member proportional representation system is presented as a tool to enhance inclusivity, particularly for women, youth, and persons with disabilities. However, this measure is both inadequately designed and poorly justified. Proportional representation, in its true sense, is meant to ensure that electoral outcomes reflect the will of the people and that marginalized voices are meaningfully included in decision-making structures. These types of systems are highly complex, with many different models in use around the world, and yet the government has not provided any analysis or research to demonstrate how they arrived at the system they outlined in the bill. The current proposal undermines that objective on several levels. First, the proportion of seats reserved for marginalized groups under the proposed system is deeply inadequate, with less than 15% for women, youth, and persons with disabilities, which is in fact lower than the existing 18% representation of women in Parliament today. This risks relegating women, youth, and persons with disabilities to the reserved seats and amounting to regression rather than progress. Secondly, the proposal entirely omits the local government level, which the Constitution mandates should also have fair representation of women, youths, and persons with disabilities. The local government level is a critical tier of our governance, and where women and youth have historically been most underrepresented. Without local government reform, any purported gains at the national level are likely to be illusory and disconnected from grassroots realities. Thirdly, the proposal lacks any binding mechanisms that require political parties to nominate more women, youth, and persons with disabilities for both constituency or penalties for non-compliance. There is little reason to believe that the proposal will translate into actual representation of gains. We may, if the proposal is adopted, in fact have less representation for marginalized groups than we currently have. Lastly, on this issue, true proportionality must go beyond representation in numbers. It must encompass equity in political influence, resources, as well as a voice. The current proposal does nothing to dismantle the institutional and cultural barriers that have historically excluded marginalized groups from our politics as a country. Ladies and gentlemen, the proposed increase in the number of constituencies, as outlined in the text of the draft bill, is concerning due to the lack of transparency and public engagement surrounding the process. Zambians have been denied the opportunity to review the delimitation report, which purportedly informed the decision to create 55 new constituencies. This opacity undermines the legitimacy of the process and erodes public trust in institutions that are tasked with upholding the principles of democracy. In a ministerial statement to the National Assembly in 2020, the then Minister of Justice informed the nation that the Electoral Commission of Zambia had proposed an increase of 90 constituencies, yet the current proposal for 55 new seats appears to deviate from this recommendation without any explanation of any sort given to the citizenry. The absence of the delimitation report prevents citizens, civil society, and other stakeholders from scrutinizing the basis for these new constitutions, raising serious concerns about whether the delineation disproportionately favors the ruling party or other vested interests. Such secrecy is anti-ethical to the principles of accountability and fairness that should underpin any process of constitutional reform. Furthermore, the lack of justification for the additional constituencies risks significantly distorting the democratic principle of equal representation as outlined in Article 59 of the Zambian Constitution, which mandates equitable delimitation of constituencies. Without a publicly available delimitation report, there is no assurance that the proposed increase ensures fair representation or indeed addresses population disparities. Instead, the arbitrary addition of 55 constituencies may lead to substantial imbalances in voting power, with some voters being significantly overrepresented and others underrepresented, thus undermining the one person, one vote principle, which is one of the key cornerstones of any democracy. This apparent disregard for constitutional safeguards and transparency not only weakens the integrity of the electoral process, but also fuels suspicion of partisan manipulation. The ECZ and the government must therefore urgently release the delimitation report and provide a very clear and evidence-based rationale for the proposed increase in order to restore public confidence and ensure that constitutional reforms serve the interests of all Zambians rather than a select few. By entrenching a larger National Assembly as a permanent feature of our political system, the reforms will likely increase long-term public expenditure rather than reduce it. Ladies and gentlemen, in a context where the cost of governance already outpaces investment in essential public services, this is an unacceptable outcome. The second issue we'd like to raise is the issue of by-elections, which we are saying is a misguided and incomplete attempt at reform. There is no doubt that the frequency and cost of by-elections in Zambia is a source of public concern and has been for a very long time. However, the proposed reforms fail to offer a principled or effective solution. Instead, they risk replacing one problem with another. The proposal lacks clear details on how vacancies will be filled by parties, creating serious legal and operational ambiguities. If political parties are to retain control of seats without clear procedures for replacement, the result would be increased political gatekeeping, reduced voter influence, and weakened accountability. A more effective solution would involve limiting by-elections to exceptional circumstances and introducing clearly defined, democratically accountable methods of replacing MPs, such as open party primaries or pre-declared party lists subjected to electoral approval. These measures would both reduce costs and indeed enhance transparency. The third issue we'd like to highlight is the term of parliament, which we are calling a disruptive and illogical adjustment. Colleagues, the proposal to dissolve parliament just one day before the general elections is both constitutionally flawed and practically unworkable. The Constitution provides that the limitation takes effect upon the dissolution of Parliament. Now, if Parliament is dissolved one day before elections, and the Constitution requires that the decisions relating to the limitation shall come into effect on the next dissolution of Parliament or councils, it would be impossible for the ECZ to conduct elections in newly created constituencies in a timely and fair manner. Voter education, ballot printing, logistical deployment, and voter roll adjustments, and indeed other tasks related to elections cannot possibly occur within 24 hours. This proposal effectively sabotages the delimitation process and exposes elections to legal challenges as well as administrative chaos. It also disrupts the democratic rhythm of governance, as parliamentarians would remain in office without performing any legislative or oversight functions for an extended period. This raises questions about the value of their continued remuneration and the constitutional basis for their presence. Instead, the Constitution should provide for a rational timeline for dissolution, ideally several months before elections, in order to allow the ECZ and other stakeholders to prepare adequately ensuring legitimacy and integrity in the entire electoral process. The fourth issue is dissolution of cabinet and councils, which we are saying is a partial reform that undermines itself. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome the proposal to dissolve cabinet ahead of elections as a safeguard against the misuse of public resources and the advantages of incumbency. However, this measure is fatally undermined by the concurrent proposal to extend the tenure of members of parliament. If ministers who were MPs continue to receive emoluments and enjoy the privileges of office without performing legislative or executive functions, this raises very serious concerns about wastefulness, unfair advantage, and public trust. Moreover, this inconsistency creates the very conditions that the reform purports to eliminate, which is continued access to state resources by politically active individuals during an election season. A consistent and coherent reform approach would require both cabinet and parliament to dissolve within a reasonable time frame, creating a level electoral playing field and restoring public confidence in the entire process. The fifth issue is the issue of MPs in councils, which we are saying is a regressive step that weakens devolution. The proposed introduction of MPs into local councils flies in the face of Zambia's long-standing commitment to devolution and democratic separation of powers. MPs serve a national legislative and oversight function and should therefore not interfere in the governance of local authorities in any way, shape, or form. This move risks concentrating power at the center, undermining local autonomy, and distorting accountability lines. Under the current proposal, on what basis would the National Assembly Committee provide oversight over the affairs of local authorities when they are actively involved in the affairs of the local authorities themselves? Historically, this dual role arrangement created the friction, confusion of roles, and undermined service delivery. It was removed precisely because it blurred the distinction between national oversight and local service delivery. Reinstating it without public consultation is both undemocratic and very dangerous. reforms are riddled with contradictions, omissions, and inconsistencies that betray a lack of vision and inclusive engagement. The proposed constitutional reforms are marred by a troubling lack of transparency regarding the studies, the reports, or research that ostensibly underpin the government's positions on various issues. The absence of publicly accessible documentation, such as the delimitation report informing the proposed increase in constituencies, prevents Zambians from understanding the rationale behind critical amendments, including the determination of which provisions are deemed non-contentious. This opacity raises serious questions about the legitimacy of the reform process and indeed undermines public trust in governance institutions. Without access to the evidence-based, whether demographic data, electoral studies, or indeed stakeholder analysis, citizens and civil society organizations are unable to scrutinize the proposals or verify their alignment with our democratic principles as a country. This lack of transparency not only violates the spirit of accountable governance, but also risks entrenching reforms that may serve partisan interests rather than the collective good and further erode confidence in the constitutional framework. Equally concerning is the absence of a credible, meaningful, and transparent consultative process to guide the development of these reforms. Constitutional amendments of this magnitude require broad-based, inclusive engagement with citizens, civil society, political parties, and other stakeholders to ensure that the resulting framework reflects the aspirations of all Zambians. Instead, this process has been marred by limited public participation and inadequate opportunities for meaningful dialogue, leaving many feeling excluded from a process that will fundamentally change the country's governance. A credible consultative process would involve public hearings, accessible dissemination of proposed changes, and clear timelines for feedback, none of which have been provided adequately in this current process. This failure to engage Zambians in a transparent and participatory manner contravenes the principles of democratic governance and risks producing a constitution that lacks legitimacy and broad-based support, ultimately undermining its durability and effectiveness. We therefore, as civil society organizations, demand an immediate halt to the current process and a reconstitution of a credible, inclusive, and transparent constitutional reform agenda. We call on the government to honor the democratic aspirations of the Zambian people and to abandon these regressive and piecemeal proposals in favor of a comprehensive, citizen-driven process. Zambia deserves a constitution that is inclusive, coherent, future-focused, and anchored in the lived realities and aspirations of its people, and not one that serves the narrow interests or short-term political convenience. Zambia, Advocates for Democratic Governance Foundation, Alliance for Accountability Advocates Zambia, Alliance for Community Action, Chapter 1 Foundation, Christian Churches Monitoring Group, Operation Young Vote, People's Action for Accountability and Governance in Zambia, Transparency International Zambia, Women in Law in Africa, and Zambia Council for Social Development. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Morris. We will now we will come to the director of CCMG. We will come and open it up for questions. Maybe for guidance purposes, please ensure that your question is on the topic that is being discussed. Other questions, I think we can take them for an appropriate time. So we will take 5 questions at once in this round, and we'll proceed like that. Okay, the first round. Yes, sir. Your name and the media house you're representing, then you can ask the question.
Good afternoon, panelists. So, my name is Mishek Ngeli Mirongo from Falcon. The question that I've got 2 questions. The first one is it normal? So that's the emphasis. Is it normal that as an independent nation, we are using a national document that was drafted and given to us by the imperialists, the former colonial masters? The second one is, would you advocate for a complete overhaul of the constitution so that it is written by indigenous people, so that it's tailored in a way that it speaks to the interest of Zambians? Thank you.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions to go. Yes. Your name, media house, and your question.
I just want to find out, since you are going for a vote to this whole constitutional process, what would you rather should be done so that it is all inclusive?
Okay. Mr. Mangala.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Mangala. I write for Zambia 24. You made so many observations. In comparison to this day, since the government appeared to be adamant and want to proceed with this.
Okay, last one for this round. Last question for this round. Okay, we will allow the panelists to respond to these 4 questions. We are still maybe thinking other questions. I will allow the Executive Director for TIZ to allocate the question. Okay, so it's free. We go a freestyle. Okay, thank you so much. I will take the lead to allocate this question.
You're saying about
Yes. So we have got 4 questions, and I'll allow the Executive Director of the One Foundation to go through.
On the first question about whether it's normal that contract independent is still relying on the constitution from the pre-colonial constitution, I think this is something which many African countries are struggling with, and processes like this tend to build on existing structures rather than help us design our own governance structures that speak to the aspirations of the Zambian people. So the civil society organizations here have been calling for comprehensive constitutional reforms, because only through comprehensive constitutional reforms can you break away from historical power structures, and that's what we need in Zambia. What should be done so that the process is all inclusive? I think the first step is to stop this process. If this is a non-contentious process, and this is what's happening. Just imagine what the contentious process, for the contentious provisions, what lies ahead. So I think the first step is to stop this process and rethink in terms of what the process should look like. We should engage citizens so that the citizens are aware of what the process should be. Citizens know where they can make submissions and build from there. On what we shall do to ensure our observations are incorporated in the bill. I think it's unfortunate that there haven't been consultations the way we hoped they should have happened. And right now the Ministry of Justice is undertaking information sessions around the country. But the first step is to share our views with the public so the public can hear what our concerns are and see how best they can be incorporated. And just to highlight, the concerns are not just about the content, they're about the process. And the process ensures that the content is secure. The reason why we are uncomfortable with the content now is because the process has lent itself to the government dictating what the content should be. So the first step is to share our perspective on the process and also highlight how flawed the content is. For example, as highlighted in the speech, if the decisions around delimitation, according to the Constitution, take effect after the dissolution of Parliament, and you propose that Parliament dissolve the day before an election, how will you practically implement the delimitation? If you say you're giving effect to the ECZ delimitation report, the government already announced in 2020 that ECZ recommended 90 new constituencies. How are we then at 55 without the people knowing? When do we get to know where the constituencies are? So I think the concern is around the process and the content. And while attempts might be made for us to focus on the content alone, but that denies many Zambians from expressing their views on what should be in their constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. Any executive director? Yes, madam.
Thank you. Maybe just to add on to the first question, like we need to have an indigenous constitution. So probably we should reflect deeply on why we always conduct amendments. It's like one government after the other requests for an amendment. So maybe it's about time we truly asked ourselves, when we set out to do an amendment to the Constitution, who are we serving? The Zambian people or the powers that be for that particular period? Because if we're not going to the root cause of the gaps in the Constitution, then we miss the point and we'll continue having the amendments, one government after the other. So if we look at the content, like for now, this proposed amendment, and the issues have been raised, I don't want to go over them again. Are they really serving the indigenous Zambian? If we put this in place, are we going to need another amendment over the same issues, or we rest this case after the amendment? So to have an indigenous constitution that is by the people of Zambia, for the people of Zambia, we need to pause and reflect. And this is why Zambians really need to look at the proposed amendments. Don't look at them. If you don't understand, please ask for interpretation. Ask for interpretation, and that's why we're concerned with the process. The people who don't understand, there's a lot of technical language in here. And then the time frame for this roadmap is very limited. Who is going to unbundle this technical language for my mother or my grandmother in Kalulushi, in Kwanyama? Who's going to explain this technical language? It means it has to be unbundled, and that requires time. And then if she understands, who's going to incorporate her proposals? Looking at the roadmap and the timelines. So if we proceed, then your question, no, we don't know if we'll get the constitution that is truly indigenous and will serve the Zambian people.
Thank you so much.
Maybe I wanted to just also add one or two thoughts. I think for me, one of the things that has been very disappointing about this whole process is the insincerity that we are seeing even from government as CSOs. And I'll give a very clear example. You will recall that at the start of this process, I think there was a statement by the Minister of Justice where she was saying that the role of government or the role of the ministry in this process would be to facilitate a discussion, facilitate a conversation. So they would, of course, make their proposals and then just sort of facilitate a process where different stakeholders are giving their more like a refereeing role. But I think what we have actually seen, the ministry taking a very active position, even, running adverts and going around doing all sorts of things, spending money. So it's clear that what we were told about what role they would take has already not been adhered to. So it's very difficult then to sort of believe anything else that comes after that. But related to that, I did note earlier this week that they listen to the views of the people on this particular subject. So it would be very unfortunate. I know Mr. Mangala is saying government is adamant that they will go ahead, which indeed appears to be the case. But for us, from where we stand, I think that it would be very unfortunate and maybe even fatal for a process such as this to go ahead, given the very clear lack of consensus that we have seen in this. So in a sense, I would like to throw the challenge to the minister to say, please live by what you have professed, that you are going to listen to the views of the stakeholders on this particular issue, because it is very clear that the views of the stakeholders are not, there's no consensus on this, and it would be very baffling for government to carry on and ram this thing down the throats of the Zambian citizenry when it is very clear that there is no consensus on it. So we are throwing a challenge to government that please live by what you have professed and listen to the concerns that are being expressed.
Okay, thank you so much, Madam Laura. Following on the line of theory that Maurice has taken just now, I think if we go even a little bit further behind, so further back, you will realize that everything that this government promised about the Constitution has been thrown out of the window. So if you go into the manifesto, which is written, the UPND manifesto promised a complete overhaul of the election, of the Constitution. They criticized the lack of consensus building. They really sounded as though they understood what we needed for a constitution. And so our question is, what happened? At what point did overhaul become again another pattern? I think if you understand how our constitution is now, to read the Zambian constitution, you need, if this passes, you're going to need 2025 here, 2016 here, 1996 here, 1991. So there's no such thing as one composite document. So even if you read now the Gazette, you'll see that article this and that is amended by. Where are you going to find that article this and that to be amended? Because it's either be in 96, it's in 2016, it's in 1991. Why are we doing this to ourselves? So the government promises, and when this government came into office, we kept saying, can we start a constitutional amendment process? So to put it on record, we need a constitutional amendment process because our constitution has major issues, but we don't need another patchwork, and we don't need another amendment that is written only for the good of those in power. If you look at the amendments, they're all about the election. If you were to ask Zambians, would Zambians say our biggest problem right now is the way we conduct elections? And then to follow up on what Kasama has said, he has suggested that government is taking the stance that we know that we continue doing the same thing over and over. So simply, the Constitution does need amendment. But this one takes us many, many years backwards. And all it does, like I keep saying, is add another chikamba on a chikamba dress. You know, to the point where original dress has disappeared into chikambas. If you see what I mean, why? What is the rush? Why should we, instead of having a full review of the Constitution, why do we need another patch? And I'll end by saying, in this Constitution, if you close your eyes, the remain seated so that